September 19, 1944. A ridge 2 kilometers south of Arracourt, Lorraine, France. Thick morning fog rolled across the farmland in grey waves, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Behrmann, commander of Panther No. 214 from the newly formed 113th Panzer Brigade, sat in his cupola and watched the mist swirl past his vision blocks. His breath fogged the glass. The Panther's Maybach engine idled with a low rumble that Behrmann could feel through the steel beneath his boots. 79 rounds of 75mm ammunition packed the fighting compartment around him. The radio crackled with terse commands in German as his company advanced in line formation toward what intelligence claimed were scattered American outposts. Behrmann adjusted his throat microphone and scanned the fog again. Nothing but grey. His loader, a 17-year-old recruit named Werner, had been with the crew for exactly 3 weeks. The driver had logged fewer than 40 hours behind the controls. The radio operator could barely distinguish American chatter from British. They were, in the parlance that experienced tankers used privately, a crew of children piloting Germany's finest weapon. The Panther beneath him represented 2 years of development, 80mm of frontal armor angled at 55 degrees, 139mm of effective thickness, and a long-barreled Key OK-42 gun that could punch through any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. Behrmann had been told this repeatedly during the rushed training at the Paderborn Proving Grounds. The Panther was invincible from the front. American Sherman tanks, with their short 75mm guns, could not penetrate the glacis plate even at point-blank range. The tactical doctrine was simple. Present your front toward the enemy, engage at long range, and let German engineering do what German engineering did best. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The fog shifted. Behrmann saw shapes, trees, perhaps a stone wall. The company commander's voice crackled again. Maintain formation, advance to phase line green. The Panthers rolled forward, tracks chewing mud, exhaust mixing with morning mist. Somewhere ahead were Americans. Somewhere in the fog were enemy tanks that Behrmann had been taught to regard as inferior in every measurable way. He did not know that 300 meters to his left, Captain Jimmy Leach's B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion had already identified his company's position. He did not know that several of those American tanks mounted not the familiar 75mm gun, but a newer, longer 76mm weapon. And he certainly did not know that some of those tanks carried a new type of ammunition his instructors had never mentioned, ammunition German intelligence had not yet fully catalogued, ammunition that would render his frontal armor advantage meaningless within the next 20 minutes. The fog was lifting. Behrmann saw the first Sherman at 200 meters, hull down behind a hedgerow, gun tube already traversing. He shouted the fire command. His gunner acquired the target. The WK-42 roared, and the armor-piercing round streaked down range. It struck the Sherman's upper glacis with a flash and a clang, and bounced away, leaving a bright scar on the American tank's armor but causing no penetration. Behrmann blinked. That wasn't supposed to happen. Then the Sherman fired back. The confidence Oberfeldwebel Behrmann carried into the fog near Arracourt that September morning was not personal arrogance. It was institutional doctrine, built from 2 years of battlefield data and metallurgical calculation. The Panther tank had been conceived in the winter of 1941 as Germany's response to the Soviet 34, whose sloped armor and mobility had shocked German forces during Operation Barbarossa. By December 1942, when the first production Panthers rolled from Mann's assembly halls, German engineers believed they had created the perfect synthesis of firepower, protection, and battlefield mobility. The technical specifications supported this belief. The Panther's upper glacis plate measured 80mm thick, positioned at 55 degrees from vertical. Basic trigonometry meant that an armor-piercing round striking this plate head-on would need to penetrate 139mm of steel, nearly 39mm more than the Tiger's vertical, 100mm frontal armor. The turret front was 100mm thick. The gun mantlet added additional layers of protection. German testing at Kummersdorf Proving Grounds in 1943 had confirmed that standard American 75mm armor-piercing rounds could not defeat this armor configuration from any practical combat range. This was not propaganda. It was mathematics, verified by captured American ammunition tested against actual Panther armor plates. The American M62 armor-piercing capped round fired from the 75mm M3 gun aboard the Sherman could penetrate approximately 92 millimeters of homogeneous armor at 500 meters when striking perpendicular to the surface. Against the Panther's sloped glacis, effective penetration capability dropped to roughly 60 millimeters equivalent. The numbers were clear. American 75mm guns could not frontally penetrate a Panther under normal combat conditions. German tactical instruction manuals reflected this advantage. Panzer crews were taught to present their frontal armor toward threats whenever possible, to engage enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters where the KOK-42's superior velocity and penetration gave decisive advantage, and to rely on armor protection during advances across open ground. The doctrine assumed that German tanks, particularly Panthers and Tigers, possessed technical superiority that could compensate for numerical inferiority. One German tank, properly employed, could defeat multiple enemy tanks through superior engineering. By September 1944, approximately 4,000 Panthers had been delivered to German armored units. They had proven effective on the Eastern Front, where their long-range firepower and frontal protection allowed them to engage Soviet 34s and KV-1s with relative safety. Crews reported high confidence in the Panther's survivability when properly positioned. Intelligence summaries noted that Soviet forces typically attempted flanking maneuvers rather than frontal assaults when facing Panther's indirect validation of the tank's design philosophy. This confidence extended to the newly formed Panzer brigades being rushed to the Western Front in autumn 1944. The 111th and 113th Panzer brigades, organized hurriedly to counter American advances across France, were equipped primarily with Panther tanks and received abbreviated training, emphasizing the tank's frontal invulnerability. Crews were told that American Sherman tanks posed minimal threat from the front, that engagements should be conducted at long range, where German optical superiority and gun performance would dominate, and that aggressive frontal advances were tactically sound when facing American armor. The American Sherman, by contrast, was understood by German intelligence as a competent but technically inferior design. Reports catalogued the Sherman's thin armor maximum 51mm on early models, 64mm on later variants, and its short-barreled 75mm M3 gun, which German analysts correctly assessed as adequate for infantry support, but marginal for anti-tank work against modern German armor. The Sherman was fast, mechanically reliable, and produced in staggering numbers, but it was not, German doctrine emphasized, a match for German heavy tanks in direct combat. This assessment had been accurate through much of 1943 and early 1944. American tank battalions in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy had indeed struggled to defeat Panthers and Tigers frontally. After-action reports from American units confirmed high casualties when engaging German heavy tanks. The tactical solution had been to use superior numbers, flanking maneuvers, artillery support, and air power to compensate for tank versus tank inferiority. German crews facing these tactics found their confidence in frontal armor repeatedly validated. If American tanks resorted to flanking attacks rather than frontal duels, it meant their guns could not penetrate German armor from the front. What German intelligence had not fully catalogued by September 1944 was the arrival of the Sherman 76, the first M4A1 tanks armed with the longer 76mm M1 gun had been produced in January 1944. These tanks began arriving in Britain in April and deployed to France in July, though in limited numbers, and often held back from initial combat due to concerns about crew training and ammunition supply. By September, perhaps 25% of Sherman tanks in frontline American armored divisions mounted the 76mm gun, a minority, but a growing one. Even this newer gun, firing standard M62A1 armor-piercing capped rounds, struggled against Panther frontal armor. Tests conducted by American forces in August 1944 on captured Panthers near Isigny, Normandy, confirmed what German tankers already believed. The 76mm gun, using standard ammunition, could not reliably penetrate the Panther's upper glacis plate. It could defeat the turret mantlet at closer ranges, and it could certainly penetrate side or rear armour, but a hull-down Panther, presenting only its glacis, remained effectively immune. German crews entering combat near Arracourt in mid-September 1944 carried this knowledge as operational gospel. Their Panthers were superior. Their frontal armour was proof against American tank guns. Aggressive tactics were justified by technical advantage. The fog that morning hid not just terrain and enemy positions, it concealed a technological shift that German intelligence had failed to detect and German doctrine had not accounted for. Somewhere in the American tank formations rolling through Lorraine were rounds that should not have existed, rounds whose existence would shatter the foundation of German tactical confidence within hours. The ammunition that would change Oberfeldwebel Behrmann's understanding of armoured warfare had been standardized just 30 days earlier. On August 15, 1944, the United States Army Ordnance Department officially designated the T-4E-20 projectile as the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round. The designation was bureaucratic. The implications were revolutionary. The M93 represented a different approach to armor penetration. Instead of a solid steel projectile, the round featured a tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body. When fired, this composite projectile achieved muzzle velocities of 3,400 feet per second, nearly 700 feet per second faster than standard armor-piercing rounds. The lighter overall weight and higher velocity translated directly to penetration capability. The M93 could punch through 157 millimeters of homogeneous armor at 500 meters, or 135 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Those numbers meant the Panther's 139 millimeters of effective frontal armor were vulnerable at typical combat ranges. Not theoretically vulnerable, actually vulnerable. The mathematics that had protected German tankers for 2 years had been recalculated by American metallurgists and ballistics engineers, and the new equation favored the attacker. Development of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition had begun in early 1942, shortly after reports from North Africa indicated German tanks possessed armor thickness and quality exceeding American capabilities to defeat. The initial work focused on 37mm rounds, then expanded to 3-inch and 76mm calibers as larger American guns entered service. The principle was simple. Tungsten carbide, one of the hardest materials available, could penetrate armor more effectively than steel if properly configured. The engineering was complex. The penetrator had to remain intact during firing and impact. The sabot surrounding it had to separate cleanly, and the whole assembly had to be manufacturable in quantities useful for combat operations. By mid-1944, American industry had solved these problems. Production of M93 ammunition began in July 1944 at a rate of 1,000 rounds per month, expanding to 5,000 per month by November and 7,000 by January 1945. The numbers sound substantial until measured against the scale of American armored operations. Thousands of Sherman tanks were operating across France and would soon push into Germany. Even at peak production, HVAP ammunition remained scarce, allocated preferentially to tank destroyer battalions whose mission specifically focused on defeating enemy armor. The scarcity created an operational paradox. The ammunition existed, it worked, but most Sherman crews would not receive it in meaningful quantities. A typical 76mm armed Sherman might carry 2 or 3 HVAP rounds among its 71-round ammunition load by autumn 1944, enough for critical engagements, but not enough to fundamentally alter tactics. Tank destroyer units received slightly better allocation, perhaps 10 to 15 rounds per vehicle by late 1944, but even this represented a small fraction of total ammunition. The limited availability meant that when HVAP rounds were used, their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. A single HVAP round defeating a Panther frontally created shockwaves through German units far exceeding the tactical significance of one tank kill. German doctrine was built on the assumption of frontal invulnerability. Shattering that assumption, even in isolated instances, undermined the psychological foundation of German armored tactics. American crews receiving HVAP ammunition in September 1944 were told several things. The rounds were extremely scarce and should be used only against heavy German armor when no other option existed. The rounds were significantly more effective than standard ammunition at all ranges, and the rounds should be carefully accounted for, as replacement supplies were uncertain. Battalion commanders emphasized that HVAP did not change fundamental American tactical approaches, numerical superiority, flanking maneuvers, artillery coordination, and air support remained primary methods for defeating German armor, but it did provide a capability that had not existed before: the ability to defeat German heavy tanks frontally when circumstances required. Some American tank battalions in the 4th Armored Division received HVAP rounds before the Arracourt engagement. Not all crews were issued them. Not all guns could fire them. Not all engagements would involve their use. But enough rounds were present in enough tanks that when German Panthers advanced through the fog on September 19th, some American tankers could respond with ammunition their opponents did not know existed. The technological asymmetry that had favored Germany since 1943 was about to reverse, not completely, not permanently, but enough to create moments of profound shock for German crews, who believed their frontal armor made them untouchable. Captain Jimmy Leach's B Company, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, was one of the units that had received several HVAP rounds for its 76mm armed Shermans. Not many rounds, not enough to change overall tactics, but enough that when Leach positioned his tanks along a tree line south of Arracourt and watched German Panthers emerge from the fog in company strength, some of his gunners loaded something other than standard armor-piercing rounds into their breeches. The Germans were advancing confidently, presenting their frontal armor, adhering to doctrine that assumed invulnerability. They would learn otherwise in approximately 90 seconds. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion with the kind of authority that came from leading combat operations since Normandy. At 30 years old, he had already earned a reputation within the 4th Armored Division as a commander who fought from the front, positioning his own M4 Sherman, which he'd named Thunderbolt, wherever the action was heaviest. His battalion's motto, "Courage Conquers," wasn't a recruitment slogan. It was operational doctrine verified in dozens of engagements across France. The 37th Tank Battalion consisted of 3 medium tank companies, A, B, and C+, a headquarters company, and supporting elements. By September 19th, the battalion had been in continuous combat operations for nearly 2 months. Combat attrition and maintenance requirements had reduced the battalion's operational strength to approximately 53 tanks from a table of organization strength of 71. The crews were exhausted but experienced. They knew their equipment intimately. They understood the limitations of their Sherman tanks, particularly when facing German heavy armor. Captain Jimmy Leach, commanding B Company, was precisely the kind of officer Abrams relied upon. Leach had led tank operations since the Normandy breakout in late July. His company had knocked out German tanks in hedgerow country, in open terrain, and in urban fighting. He understood that the Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther frontally. He knew that standard doctrine called for flanking maneuvers, artillery support, and combined arms coordination to defeat German heavy tanks. Direct frontal engagement was typically suicide. But Leach's company included several tanks mounting the newer 76mm gun. These had arrived as replacements in late August and early September. The longer gun tube was immediately visible 52 calibers in length compared to the 75's 40 calibers. The ammunition was different too. Standard armor-piercing rounds for the 76 were designated M92A1. They could penetrate 143 millimeters of homogeneous armor at 100 meters, 97 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Against the Panther's sloped glacis, those numbers translated to marginal penetration capability at best. Then, 3 days before the German counteroffensive began, several of Leach's 76mm equipped tanks had received additional ammunition. The rounds came forward with specific instructions: high-velocity armor piercing, use only against heavy German armor, extremely limited supply. The rounds were marked differently, black projectiles with white markings, compared to the standard armor-piercing rounds black with yellow markings. The weight difference was noticeable too. The HVAP round weighed 9.92 pounds compared to 15.43 pounds for standard armor piercing. Leach's gunners had been briefed on the new ammunition's characteristics. Muzzle velocity, 3,400 feet per second. Penetration capability, 157mm at 500 meters, 135 at 1,000. Those numbers meant something important. The Panther's glacis, with its 139mm of effective thickness, was vulnerable. Not theoretically vulnerable, actually penetrable at combat ranges. But the rounds were scarce. Most tanks received perhaps 2 rounds, some received none. The ammunition represented capability, not abundance. The tactical situation near Arracourt on September 19th had been developing for several days. German forces had launched their counter-offensive on September 18th, striking initially at Luneville before pivoting northward toward the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A. Intelligence reports indicated substantial German armour, possibly 2 Panzer brigades operating in the sector. The fog that morning prevented air reconnaissance and limited ground visibility to under 100 meters in some areas. Combat Command A, under the command of Colonel Bruce Clark, had positioned its forces in a defensive arc around Arracourt. The 37th Tank Battalion held the southern approaches. The defensive position was inherently weak, a thinly held salient with extended lines and limited reserves, but Clark had positioned his forces to take advantage of terrain features. Ridgelines provided hull-down positions, tree lines offered concealment. The Americans understood they were outnumbered but believed superior tactics and terrain use could compensate. Abrams had positioned Leach's B Company along a low ridge, approximately 1,000 meters south of Arracourt proper. The position offered visibility across open farmland once the fog lifted. A tree line provided partial concealment. The company deployed in a dispersed formation with interlocking fields of fire, standard defensive positioning. Leach kept his 76mm tanks positioned centrally, where they could respond to threats from multiple directions. His gunners had been told, if you see Panthers, if you have clear shots, if you have HVAP loaded, take the shot. Don't wait for flanking opportunities that might not materialize. The German forces advancing through that fog belonged to the 113th Panzer Brigade, a unit formed barely 2 months earlier as part of Hitler's emergency program to reconstitute German armoured strength on the Western Front. The brigade had been equipped with new Panther tanks, AUSF-G models with the full 80mm glacis armour and improved final drives. The crews, however, were not new. Most were replacements, teenagers and men pulled from other units, given abbreviated training at proving grounds in Germany, and shipped forward to fill out the brigade's ranks. Oberfeldwebel Beermann was more experienced than most. He'd served on the Eastern Front in 1943 before being wounded and reassigned to training duties. His return to combat command in September 1944 meant leading a crew with minimal experience. His gunner had qualified on the Panther's WWII 42 gun at Paderborn 3 weeks earlier. His driver had fewer than 40 hours operating the Maybach engine. His loader could manage the physical demands of handling 75mm rounds, but had never been in combat. His radio operator understood German tactical communications, but couldn't reliably distinguish Allied radio chatter. Beermann's Panther, No. 214, carried standard combat load. 79 rounds of 75mm ammunition, distributed between armor-piercing, high-explosive, and smoke rounds. The armor-piercing rounds were Panzer grenade 39-42, capable of penetrating 124mm of armour at 1,000 metres when striking perpendicular. Against sloped Sherman armour at typical combat ranges, these rounds were devastating. Beermann had been taught this at Paderborn. His training officer had emphasised that the Panther could engage and destroy American Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters with near certainty of first-round kill. The tactical instructions for the 113th Panzer Brigade's attack on September 19th called for a coordinated advance in company strength toward Arracourt, maintaining line formation, presenting frontal armor toward expected American positions, and engaging at maximum effective range. The fog complicated these instructions. Visibility was minimal, radio communication was intermittent, and maintaining formation was difficult, but the underlying doctrine remained clear. Panthers possessed decisive technical superiority. Aggressive forward movement was tactically justified. American tanks would be forced to maneuver for flanking shots, exposing themselves to German fire. Behrman's company advanced through the fog, with engines throttled back to reduce noise. The advance was slow, cautious, blind. Every shape in the mist could be an enemy position. Every shadow could hide American anti-tank guns. The tension in Panther 214's crew compartment was palpable. Werner's breathing audible over the intercom, the driver's hands tight on the controls, Behrman's eyes scanning endlessly through vision blocks that showed only grey. Somewhere ahead were Americans. Somewhere in the fog was combat. Somewhere very close was a technological collision that German doctrine had not prepared Behrman to survive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fog lifted at approximately 9:15 hours on September 19th. Not completely, wisps of mist still drifted across the farmland, but enough that visibility extended to several hundred meters. From his position in B Company's defensive line, Captain Leach saw the Panthers emerge from the grey-like ships materializing from ocean fog. One, then three, then an entire company advancing in rough line formation across open ground. Range, approximately 600 meters, and closing. Leach's radio crackled with reports from his platoon leaders. Enemy armor, multiple vehicles, Panthers confirmed by the distinctive long gun tubes and sloped glacis plates. The German tanks were advancing confidently, not buttoned up, turret hatches open on several vehicles. They were presenting their frontal armor directly toward the American positions, textbook German doctrine when facing Shermans. The Panthers' commanders clearly believed they were invulnerable from that angle. Staff Sergeant James Morphew commanded the lead platoon in Leach's defensive position. His Sherman mounted a 76mm gun. Among his ammunition load were 2 HVAP rounds, carefully positioned in the ready rack where his loader could access them instantly. Morphew had been briefed 3 days earlier. These rounds can defeat Panther frontal armor at practical combat ranges. Use them wisely. You won't get more. Morphew had marked the rounds with chalk, so his loader couldn't mistake them in the stress of combat. At 550 meters, Morphew identified his target, the lead Panther in the German formation, hull fully visible now that the fog had thinned. He could see the commander in the cupola, binoculars raised, scanning the American positions. The Panther was still advancing, tracks churning mud, exhaust visible from the rear deck. Morphew gave the fire command. His gunner, Corporal Frank Ordefrid, had already laid the gun. The loader slammed an HVAP round into the breech, the distinctive black projectile with white markings and confirmed readiness. The Sherman's 76mm gun fired. The tungsten-core projectile left the muzzle at 3,400 feet per second, crossing 550 meters in less than half a second. It struck the Panther's upper glacis plate precisely where the armor was thickest, 80 millimeters of steel angled at 55 degrees, 139 millimeters of effective thickness. Under normal circumstances, with standard ammunition, this shot would have failed to penetrate. The shell would have struck the sloped armor, shed velocity, and either ricocheted away or shattered against the hardened steel face. The HVAP round penetrated. The tungsten core punched through the glacis plate, through the driver's compartment, through ammunition stored in hull racks, and detonated several rounds of German 75mm ammunition in a catastrophic secondary explosion. The Panther's front glacis plate bulged outward from internal pressure. Smoke and flame erupted from the driver's hatch and every vision port. The tank stopped instantly. Track brakes locked. Within seconds, the crew began bailing out those who could. The driver never emerged. The radio operator escaped through his hatch, clothing on fire. The commander and gunner abandoned the turret. Oberfeldwebel Berman, commanding Panther 214 approximately 100 meters to the disabled tank's right, saw the hit. He saw the penetration. He saw a round from an American tank, presumably a Sherman, presumably armed with either a 75 or 76mm gun punch through a Panther's frontal armor from 600 meters and cause a catastrophic kill. This was not supposed to be possible. Berman had been taught explicitly at Paderborn that Sherman guns could not defeat Panther glacis armor from the front. The mathematics of armor, thickness and projectile penetration made frontal penetration impossible at practical combat ranges. Yet Berman had just watched it happen. The evidence was burning 50 meters ahead of his own Panther. The disabled tank was fully visible now, flames pouring from the fighting compartment, crew members sprawled in the mud around it. The American gun that had fired Berman could see the smoke dissipating from the muzzle, was positioned hull down behind a slight rise, only the turret visible. It was not maneuvering for a flank shot. It had engaged frontally and won. Berman's radio operator reported more impacts across the company front. Another Panther hit, turret penetrated. A third Panther struck in the glacis plate and disabled, crew abandoning. The American fire was precise, deliberate, and effective. German doctrine called for aggressive forward movement to close range and bring superior firepower to bear, but closing range meant exposing more of the hull. It meant presenting larger targets, and if American guns could penetrate Panther armor at 600 meters, they could certainly penetrate at 400 or 200. The company commander's voice crackled over the radio, ordering immediate withdrawal to covered positions. The attack had lasted less than 10 minutes. 3 Panthers were burning. Several more had been struck but remained mobile. The American defensive line had not wavered. German tactical superiority, the presumed advantage of frontal armor invulnerability, had been negated by ammunition. German intelligence had either not known about or had catastrophically underestimated. Berman reversed his Panther, backing down the slope he'd just crested. His mind processed what he'd witnessed. American tanks had engaged Panthers frontally and penetrated glacis armor that was supposed to be impervious to their guns. The tactical doctrine he'd been taught present frontal armor, engage at long range, rely on technical superiority, had failed in the most fundamental way possible. The protection he'd counted on didn't exist. The advantage he'd believed in was illusory. The mathematics had changed, and no one had told him. Similar realizations were occurring across the 113th Panzer, brigade's formation. Panther crews who'd advanced confidently that morning, secure in their technical superiority, were now withdrawing in disorder. The fog that had concealed their approach now concealed their retreat. But the psychological damage was done. They had learned that American guns could kill them frontally. They had learned that their armor wasn't invincible. They had learned that the war had changed in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. By 1300 hours on September 19th, Combat Command A had repulsed the initial German attack. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion reported 11 German tanks destroyed in their sector, with American losses of 2 Shermans knocked out and 1 damaged but recoverable. The exchange ratio 11-2 was extraordinary for an engagement where German forces possessed technical superiority in armor and firepower. But the ratio wasn't the significant detail. The significant detail was how those kills had been achieved. 6 of the 11 German tanks destroyed by the 37th Tank Battalion had been knocked out by frontal shots, glacis penetrations, or turret hits from angles that standard American ammunition should not have defeated. After-action reports compiled later that day noted the use of special ammunition by several tank crews. The reports didn't elaborate on the ammunition type. Operational security classified the specifics of HVAP capabilities, but tank commanders understood what had happened. The new rounds worked. They worked well, and they had achieved results that fundamentally altered tactical calculations. Captain Leach's B Company alone accounted for 4 Panthers destroyed by frontal engagement. Leach's after-action report, filed that evening, noted laconically, "Engaged enemy armor at ranges from 400 to 600 meters. New ammunition proved effective against frontal aspects of Panther tanks. Crew morale excellent. Request resupply of special ammunition soonest. The request for resupply would not be fulfilled immediately. HVAP production remained limited, but the request itself signaled a shift in American tactical thinking. If ammunition existed that could defeat German heavy tanks frontally, American crews wanted it in quantity. German forces continued attacking near Arracourt for another 3 days, launching multiple company-strength assaults against Combat Command A's positions on September 20th, 21st, and 22nd. Each attack followed similar patterns: German Panthers advancing in formation, American defenders using terrain and positioning to their advantage, German tanks being knocked out at ranges where their frontal armor should have provided protection. By September 22nd, the 113th Panzer Brigade had been reduced to fewer than 20 operational tanks from the approximately 70 it had fielded on September 19th. The 111th Panzer Brigade, committed to combat on September 20th, suffered similar casualties. German unit war diaries from this period reflect growing confusion and demoralization. A report from the 113th Panzer Brigade dated September 21st noted, "American anti-tank capabilities appear significantly improved. Multiple Panthers destroyed by frontal hits at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Recommend investigation into new American ammunition types." The recommendation never received systematic follow-through. German intelligence remained fragmented. Communication between frontline units and rear area analysis sections was poor, and the overall strategic situation in France was deteriorating too rapidly for methodical technical assessments. Individual German tankers, however, understood perfectly well what had changed. Oberfeldwebel Behrmann survived the September 19th engagement and fought in subsequent actions near Arracourt. His Panther was eventually knocked out on September 22nd by an American 76mm gun firing from approximately 400 meters. The round struck the glacis plate and penetrated into the crew compartment, wounding Behrmann and killing his driver. After being evacuated to a field hospital, Behrmann provided a detailed account to his company commander. American tanks possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panther frontal armor at typical combat ranges. Frontal engagement was no longer tactically sound. German armor advantages had been neutralized. Similar accounts filtered through German armored units across the Western Front throughout autumn 1944. Not every engagement involved HVAP ammunition. The scarcity of the rounds meant most tank versus tank combat still featured standard ammunition, but enough encounters occurred that German tactical doctrine began adjusting. Instructions to Panther crews shifted from present frontal armor and engage at long range toward avoid frontal exposure whenever possible, use terrain for protection, engage from hull-down positions. The confidence that had characterized German armored operations earlier in the war was eroding. The Battle of Arracourt concluded on September 29th with German forces withdrawing toward the German frontier. The 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive had failed completely. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns committed to the battle, only 62 remained operational by month's end. American losses totaled 25 tanks destroyed and 7 tank destroyers knocked out. The exchange ratio over 8-1 in favor of American forces reflected not just tactical superiority, but a fundamental shift in technological balance. The psychological impact on German tankers who survived Arracourt extended well beyond the immediate tactical lessons. These crews had entered combat believing their Panthers were superior to any Allied tank. They had been taught that frontal armor provided reliable protection. They had operated under tactical doctrine that emphasized aggressive forward movement based on technical advantages. All of these beliefs had been shattered in a matter of days. The Panther was still a formidable tank, better protected than the Sherman, mounting a superior gun, possessing advantages in long-range firepower, but it was no longer invincible. Its primary defensive advantage had been negated by American engineering. Word of the Arracourt engagement spread through German armored forces during October and November 1944. Tankers being rotated from the Eastern Front to the Western Front received briefings that mentioned American ammunition developments. Crews training on new Panthers at Paderborn were warned that American 76mm guns posed greater threat than previously assessed. The confident superiority that German tankers had carried into combat through 1943 and early 1944 was being replaced by caution, by recognition that technical advantages could be countered, by understanding that American industrial capacity could produce solutions to tactical problems. The admission that frontal armor meant less than doctrine had claimed, that American guns could kill Panthers from angles that should have been safe, that technical superiority was no longer decisive, never appeared in official German documents with that explicit phrasing. But the admission was implicit in every tactical instruction issued after Arracourt that emphasized defensive positioning over aggressive assault. It was implicit in every after-action report that noted American ammunition improvements. It was implicit in the experiences of German tankers who had watched their supposedly impenetrable armor being penetrated by rounds they hadn't known existed. The ocean of armored supremacy that German forces had navigated since 1941 had become contested water. The Americans had built the technology to compete, and at Arracourt, German tankers learned that technological advantage was temporary, that industrial capacity mattered more than individual excellence, and that the armor they'd trusted with their lives was vulnerable in ways their training had never acknowledged. The Battle of Arracourt ended German hopes of halting General Patton's Third Army before it reached the German frontier. By early October 1944, the 5th Panzer Army had been reduced to ineffective remnants, its Panzer brigades gutted by losses that could not be replaced. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had fielded approximately 70 Panther tanks on September 18th, possessed fewer than 15 operational vehicles by October 5th. The 111th Panzer Brigade fared marginally better, but remained combat ineffective. German armoured strength in Lorraine had been shattered not by overwhelming numbers, though American numerical superiority existed, but by the negation of German technical advantages. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion continued operations through the autumn and winter of 1944, spearheading 4th Armoured Division advances across France, through Luxembourg, and into Germany. Abrams himself would lead the relief column that broke through to the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne on December 26, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The lead tank in that column, a Sherman commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess and nicknamed Cobra King, carried both standard and HVAP ammunition. By December 1944, HVAP allocation had improved marginally, though scarcity remained chronic. The 37th Tank Battalion's final accounting for World War II showed 14 American tanks lost while destroying 55 German Panthers and Tigers, an exchange ratio that reflected both superior tactics and the technological equalizer that HVAP ammunition provided. Captain Jimmy Leach survived the war and later testified to military historians about the significance of HVAP ammunition at Arracourt. His statement, recorded in 1946, noted, "The new ammunition changed everything. Before we got it, engaging a Panther from the front was suicide. After we got it, we could fight them on more equal terms. The problem was, we never had enough of it. If we'd had adequate supplies, the fighting would have been very different." Leach's observation captured the central paradox of HVAP deployment. The ammunition worked brilliantly when used, but production limitations meant it remained a tactical option rather than a strategic game-changer. American ammunition production figures illuminate this scarcity. In November 1944, 2 months after Arracourt, monthly HVAP production reached 5,000 rounds for 76mm guns. By comparison, monthly production of standard armor-piercing ammunition exceeded 100,000 rounds. The disparity reflected tungsten carbide supply constraints. Tungsten, essential for HVAP penetrator cores, was a strategic material with competing demands across American war industry. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges. Artillery shells used tungsten in specialized applications. Aircraft engines needed tungsten in high-temperature components. Allocating tungsten to tank ammunition competed against these other requirements. American planners prioritized maintaining diverse industrial capabilities over maximizing any single weapons system's effectiveness. The production constraints meant that even by war's end in May 1945, HVAP remained scarce in frontline American tank units. A typical Sherman battalion might possess 50 to 100 HVAP rounds distributed across its entire complement of 71 tanks, enough for critical engagements but insufficient to alter standard tactics. Tank destroyer battalions, whose specific mission focused on defeating enemy armor, received preferential allocation but still operated under strict ammunition discipline. Crews were instructed to use HVAP only when absolutely necessary, to account for every round expended, and to expect limited resupply. German intelligence eventually catalogued HVAP ammunition characteristics, but not until spring 1945 when the war's outcome was already determined. A German ordnance report dated March 1945 analyzed captured HVAP rounds and concluded, American tungsten-core ammunition represents significant improvement in anti-armor capability, capable of defeating Panther frontal armor at ranges up to 800 meters. Recommend immediate development of German equivalent. The recommendation came far too late. German industrial capacity in March 1945 was collapsing under sustained Allied bombing. Tungsten supplies were nearly exhausted. Production facilities were being overrun by advancing Allied armies. German armor development, which had pioneered so many innovations earlier in the war, could not respond to American technological advances. The exchange ratios from Arracourt 8 German tanks destroyed for every American tank lost represented the most favorable outcome American armored forces achieved against German heavy armor during World War II. Subsequent engagements, including the battles around the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, showed more modest ratios as German tactical adaptations took effect and HVAP scarcity limited its impact. But Arracourt demonstrated conclusively that American industry could produce technological solutions to battlefield problems, that German technical superiority was not permanent, and that industrial capacity ultimately mattered more than individual weapon excellence. Oberfeldbermann wounded on September 22 and evacuated to a military hospital in Germany, recovered from his injuries and returned to duty in December 1944. He was assigned to a replacement Panzer battalion being formed for commitment to the Eastern Front. In January 1945, his unit was diverted to Hungary, where German forces were attempting to relieve Budapest. Berman survived the war and was captured by Soviet forces in April 1945. He spent 4 years in Soviet captivity before returning to Germany in 1949. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, Berman recalled Arracourt as the moment when he understood Germany would lose the war. We had believed our Panthers were invincible from the front. When I saw that American round punch through our glacis plate, I knew the technical advantage was gone. After that, it was only a matter of time. The technological revelation at Arracourt formed part of a larger pattern that characterized the final 18 months of World War II in Europe. German forces, which had enjoyed technical and tactical superiority through 1943, increasingly found their advantages neutralized by Allied industrial and technological responses. The same dynamic that produced HVAP ammunition to counter Panther armor drove development of proximity-fused artillery shells, improved anti-aircraft systems, and enhanced signals intelligence capabilities. American and British capacity to identify problems, engineer solutions, and produce those solutions at scale exceeded German ability to maintain technical leads. The contrast was most visible in armor technology. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks during World War II, a formidable number representing massive industrial investment. The Panthers were technically sophisticated, mounting excellent guns and possessing strong armor protection, but American industry produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks in all variants during the same period, including approximately 11,000 mounting the 76mm gun capable of firing HVAP. The numerical disparity, 8 American tanks for every German Panther, overwhelmed whatever technical advantages individual German vehicles possessed. More significantly, American production was backed by industrial depth that Germany could not match. When Sherman tanks were knocked out, replacements arrived within weeks. When ammunition supplies ran low, production increased. When tactical deficiencies were identified, engineering solutions followed. The development timeline for HVAP ammunition illustrated this capacity. Problem identified in 1942, solution engineered by early 1944, production initiated by summer 1944, deployment to combat units by August 1944. The entire cycle from concept to battlefield implementation took less than 2 years and occurred while American industry simultaneously produced aircraft, artillery, ships, trucks, and every other category of military equipment. German industry, by contrast, operated under constraints that prevented equivalent responsiveness. Allied strategic bombing disrupted production schedules. Raw material shortages forced compromises in manufacturing quality. The need to produce defensive weapons, anti-aircraft guns, tank destroyers, fortification equipment competed against offensive weapons production. By autumn 1944, German tank production was declining even as Allied production accelerated. The Panther remained technically formidable, but Panthers destroyed in combat were increasingly difficult to replace. The psychological impact on German armoured forces extended beyond tactical adjustments. Tankers who had operated with confidence in their equipment's superiority throughout 1942 and 1943 faced growing recognition that Allied forces possessed countermeasures to every German advantage. Panther's frontal armour could be defeated by HVAP ammunition. The Tiger's heavy protection was vulnerable to flanking attacks coordinated with artillery and air support. German optical superiority, the excellent Zeiss rangefinders, and gun sights that had given German tanks advantage in long-range engagements meant less when Allied forces could call upon aerial observation and artillery support that German forces increasingly lacked. This erosion of confidence appeared in German military correspondence from late 1944 and early 1945. Unit commanders reported declining morale among tank crews who understood their operational disadvantages. Training officers noted that replacement crews lacked the skills and experience of earlier cohorts, while simultaneously facing more capable Allied opponents. Intelligence summaries acknowledged that American and British forces had closed technical gaps that had existed earlier in the war. The institutional arrogance that had characterized German armored forces through 1943, the certainty that German engineering and tactical excellence would prevail, had been replaced by grimmer realism. The 4th Armoured Division, which had administered the defeat at Arracourt, continued operations through Germany in spring 1945. The division participated in the Rhine crossing in March, drove deep into central Germany in April, and by war's end in May had advanced farther east than any other American armoured unit. The division's final statistics, 488 days of combat, advances covering over 1,000 miles, thousands of German vehicles destroyed reflected the success of American armoured doctrine, numerical superiority, aggressive manoeuvre, combined arms coordination, and technological adaptability. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, who had commanded the 37th Tank Battalion through Arracourt and Bastogne, ended the war as a colonel commanding combat, Command B of the 4th Armoured Division. His post-war career would take him to the highest levels of American military leadership, commanding general in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972, then Army Chief of Staff from 1972 until his death in 1974. The Monet Abrams main battle tank, introduced in 1980, was named in his honor a technological lineage connecting the Sherman tanks he commanded at Arracourt to the modern armored vehicles that would incorporate lessons learned from World War II armor combat. The technical lessons from Arracourt influenced post-war American tank development. The recognition that tungsten-core ammunition could defeat heavy armor informed development of armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot ammunition for Cold War-era tank guns. The understanding that frontal armor could be penetrated by high-velocity rounds drove development of composite armor and reactive armor systems designed to defeat such projectiles. The tactical lessons that industrial capacity mattered more than individual technical excellence, that technological advantages were temporary, that combined arms coordination, trumped single-weapon superiority shaped American armored doctrine for decades. German technical innovations from World War II, the sloped armor of the Panther, the heavy protection of the Tiger, the long-barreled, high-velocity guns that equipped German tanks influenced every major nation's post-war tank designs. Soviet, American, and British tanks adopted sloped armor configurations. Gun design emphasized high velocity and long-range penetration. Armor protection increased steadily through the Cold War, but the lesson of Arracourt that armor advantages could be defeated by ammunition technology, that protection was a temporary condition subject to engineering countermeasures, remained central to post-war armored warfare theory. The fog that lifted over Arracourt on September 19th, 1944 revealed more than German Panther tanks advancing toward American defensive positions. It revealed the end of an era in armored warfare, the moment when German technical superiority, carefully cultivated through years of development, validated in combat across Europe and Russia, embedded in doctrine and training, proved vulnerable to American industrial and technological response. The HVAP rounds that punched through Panther glacis plates that morning represented not just improved ammunition, but the culmination of a different approach to warfare. Identify problems, engineer solutions, and produce at scale. Deploy to forces that could exploit the advantages. For German tankers like Oberfeldwebel Klaus Behrmann, the realization came with visceral immediacy. The Panther, burning ahead of his own tank, struck frontally and killed instantly by a gun that should not have been capable of the penetration. Destroyed assumptions that had governed German armored tactics for 2 years. Frontal armor was not invincible. Technical superiority was not permanent. American forces possessed capabilities. German intelligence had failed to detect, and German doctrine had not prepared defenders to counter. The confidence that had sustained German armored forces through years of combat against numerically superior enemies evaporated in minutes of engagement near an obscure French village. The admission that frontal armor meant nothing, or more precisely, that it meant less than German doctrine had claimed, never appeared in official German military communications with that explicit phrasing, but the admission was implicit in every tactical modification issued after Arracourt, in every after-action report noting unexpected American capabilities, in every training instruction that emphasized defensive positioning over aggressive assault. German tankers who survived encounters with HVAP ammunition carried the knowledge that their primary defensive advantage had been negated, that American guns could kill them from angles previously considered safe, that the technological balance had shifted in ways that left them increasingly vulnerable. The production statistics tell part of the story. Germany produced 6,000 Panthers. America produced 49,000 Shermans. Germany allocated scarce tungsten to machine tools and artillery. America produced HVAP ammunition in quantities sufficient to deploy to frontline units, albeit in limited numbers. Germany's industrial capacity strained under Allied bombing and resource shortages. America's industrial capacity accelerated through 1944 and 45, producing ever-increasing quantities of equipment at improving quality levels. The numerical disparity was overwhelming, but beyond the numbers lay a more fundamental difference. American capacity to respond to battlefield challenges with technological solutions exceeded German capacity to maintain advantages. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the technical one. German armored forces that had dominated battlefields through 1943 entered 1944 with confidence born of repeated success. That confidence eroded steadily through the year as tactical disadvantages accumulated. Fuel shortages limiting mobility, air supremacy enabling Allied coordination, numerical inferiority forcing defensive operations, and finally technological parity, removing the armor advantages that had sustained German tactical effectiveness. By winter 1944, German tankers understood they were fighting a losing war, that their excellent equipment could not compensate for strategic and industrial disadvantages, that courage and skill could not overcome systemic deficiencies. Captain Jimmy Leach's B Company, which had knocked out 4 Panthers frontally on September 19th, using HVAP ammunition, continued combat operations through the end of the war. The company's tankers never forgot. That morning, when the new ammunition proved effective, when German tanks that had seemed invulnerable were destroyed by frontal hits, when tactical calculations changed in fundamental ways. But they also understood the limitations. HVAP remained scarce. Most engagements still required flanking maneuvers and combined arms coordination. The ammunition was a tool, not a panacea. American victory came from systematic advantages across every dimension of warfare, not from single technological solutions. The wire recordings preserved in American archives, not of Arracourt, but of similar engagements throughout autumn and winter. 1944 captured the sounds of Sherman guns firing HVAP rounds, the impacts on German armor, the secondary explosions as penetrations caused catastrophic kills. Modern ballistic analysis confirms that HVAP ammunition could reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor at ranges up to 800 meters under good conditions. The technology worked. The question was never whether HVAP could defeat German armor, but whether American production could provide sufficient quantities to alter tactical balance across entire theaters of operation. The answer was partial, enough to matter in specific engagements like Arracourt, insufficient to eliminate American tactical disadvantages everywhere. Oberfeldwebel Behrman, interviewed 40 years after the war, reflected on the moment he watched an American round penetrate his company commander's Panther. "We had believed we were superior. We had been taught that our tanks could not be defeated from the front. When I saw that penetration, when I understood that American guns could kill us despite our armor, I knew the war was lost. Not immediately, we fought for 8 more months, but the outcome was inevitable. They could solve problems faster than we could create advantages." That was the real lesson of Arracourt, the ocean of assumed superiority that German armored forces had navigated since. 1941 became contested water through 1944. At Arracourt, in the morning fog of September 19th, German tankers learned that American technology could challenge their best equipment, that industrial capacity ultimately determined outcomes, that the armor they trusted with their lives was vulnerable to engineering solutions produced in factories they would never see. The fog lifted to reveal not just enemy positions, but the end of German armored dominance, the beginning of technological parity, and the inevitable conclusion of a war that would be decided by industrial production rather than tactical excellence. The story of Arracourt, of HVAP ammunition, defeating Panther frontal armor, of German confidence shattered by unexpected capability, of tactical assumptions overturned by technological development, stands as testament to a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Technical advantages are temporary. Industrial capacity shapes outcomes, and in the contest between German engineering excellence and American industrial might, production ultimately overwhelmed sophistication. The Panthers that burned near Arracourt that September morning marked not just tactical defeats but the end of an illusion, that frontal armor meant invincibility, that technical superiority guaranteed victory, that individual excellence could overcome systemic advantages. The Americans had built the ammunition to penetrate German armor. German tankers, watching their supposedly impregnable tanks burn from frontal hits, learned that the war had changed, that their advantages had evaporated, and that the ocean was no longer theirs. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.